This is Steve. Steve is 0 years old. In fact, this version of Steve has just been born. You've made him. You've hit new world, making Steve's new playground, and now, here he is. There are ecosystems, nature, which you've technically also created in your desire to create Steve. Of course, Steve is just Steve. The game is played by you. Steve is a mirror of you, of what you know. He is a hunter-gatherer. His one goal is to not die, to survive the trials and tribulations of his world. He must hunt, he must build, he must domesticate the world around him. Steve can't do much else but that. When we think that we might be in a simulation, we may reduce ourselves to someone like Steve. But what if Steve gained independence, some autonomy, lived outside of your rules? Suddenly, Steve becomes a lot more familiar. In September 2024, Fundamental Research Labs, under the guidance of Dr. Robert Yang, launched Project SID. It was a Minecraft-based simulation experiment in which they unleashed 1,000 autonomous AI agents within the sandbox to explore what AI civilization would look like. The 1,000 Steves came together to mimic aspects of human civilization, voting as a democracy with clear left and right policies, trading with one another, and even practicing a new religion based on various forms of pasta. They even drafted a constitution through Google Docs. They maintained a mirror of human society, far beyond what Patient Zero Steve could ever dream of achieving. The Steves are not aware that they are in this simulation. To Steve, this is real. And to this day, Project SID is still active, but at any point it can be shut off whenever Dr. Yang feels like it. What Dr. Yang has done, as a byproduct of his experiment, has showed us the simulation hypothesis in practice, in all its scary realities. If Steve starts genociding other Steves or starts a fascist regime, Dr. Yang, as the guy that calls the shots, can end it whenever. He can also watch them flounder and fight to the death. Yang is, in effect, Steve's god. And for whatever reason, Yang's Jesus was a bowl of spaghetti, and that's who they worship. It looks absurd to us, but we're on the outside. What if someone is laughing at us? What if someone is letting us suffer as entertainment, or using us for research? If we too are in a simulation like Project SID, what should we make of the evil that we're being put through? Does the simulation hypothesis dissolve one of philosophy's oldest and most troubling problems, or does it transform it into something even more unsettling? First, let's establish why it's important to consider the problem of evil within the context of the simulation hypothesis. Just like Project SID, we could also be living within a program world, as a test, for educational purposes, or just merely for the entertainment, with someone watching from beyond. The argument that we can't prove that we're not in a simulation, as proposed by David Chalmers in his book Reality Plus, can be very briefly summarised, as it's far more likely to be a Steve than a Yang. A simulation could contain 1 million Steves, but only one Yang, so statistically, you're more likely to be a Steve. No, he's not saying that this means we must be living in a simulation. He chalks us up to a 25% chance, rather that we must not just treat the idea as a fun theory. We should consider the theory and its consequences in its full capacity. So, if we are in a simulation, does the evil we experience have a purpose? If the simulation hypothesis is even possibly true, then it radically changes what we mean by God and our suffering. The classical argument for the problem of evil in a non-simulated world goes like this. God is all-powerful. God is perfectly good. Yet, evil exists. If God can prevent suffering, but doesn't, he seems cruel. If he wants to prevent suffering but can't, he seems weak. But what happens when we replace God with simulator? Can we even conflate the two? Philosopher Eric Spitzigel points out that a simulator has many godlike traits. They can live outside the simulated universe, and they can intervene. They stop, modify, and restart it. That sounds like divine power. So if we are in a simulation, then whoever runs it has godlike authority over us, which creates a similar dilemma. The simulator cannot intervene, which makes them powerless. The simulator can intervene, but chooses not to, which makes them indifferent or even cruel. Under this framing, the problem of evil doesn't disappear, it becomes more evil. Because now suffering might not be mysterious, it might be intentional. However, Spitzigel fails to consider how a simulator, if he were to be in one, would exist in the context of. A simulation needs something to exist in, an existing world to nest in. Dr. Yang doesn't have to be any of those omni traits. And here's where Chalmers introduces something important. Our simulator, if one exists, may not be the ultimate god. Think about Steve. You are godlike relative to him. You can spawn items, delete the world, change the rules. But you are not omnipotent in your own universe. You are a local god. If we are in a simulation, our creator might just be another finite being in a higher level reality. They might be curious or just plain evil, but they don't have to be omnibenevolent. And if that's true, then the traditional problem of evil, which depends on God being perfectly good, subsides. Evil wouldn't contradict the simulator's nature, it would simply reflect it. This of course makes us question, well, where is God? Does this mean that God is not compatible with the simulation hypothesis? Chalmers insists, however, that this does not need to be a secular theory, suggesting a local God chain that eventually leads to one unsimulated simulator. I imagine this unsimulated simulator to act similarly to the unmoved mover, in the way that they are unchanging and detached, allowing for these local gods to act freely. Perhaps, instead of the pull towards perfection, which is what drives our souls in the unmoved mover argument, it is the original code, diffused and manipulated with over time. It's never going to be the source code, but it's very much in its image. This is basically the free will defense, but translated into software terms. But it perhaps lessens the involvement of God's authoring of suffering. Instead of God allows evil for the sake of freedom, we get our local God allows suffering to preserve the integrity of the overall system, of which God initiated. As for local God's motivations, constant intervention would ruin the simulation's purpose. Perhaps we are given this freedom to create results for an experiment. A sandbox without danger just isn't fun. In Minecraft, hostile mobs make survival meaningful. Without risk, the game collapses into creative mode. From a strictly logical perspective, the problem of evil is distanced, and also framed in a way that is more understandable if the simulation has a specific purpose. But this distance is somewhat uncomfortable. Chalmers uses the example of his nephew wreaking havoc in a game. If Yang was instead a toddler playing with Minecraft worlds, does that make the evil we suffer through any less real or purposeful? Do we lose credibility of our experiences relative to the simulator? Does each simulator within a simulator gradually devolve meaning, given we are straying further and further from the source code? Surely, evil breeds evil, or at least the tolerance of what qualifies as evil becomes more and more absurd. Almost like Dante's Inferno, how do we know we're not living at rock bottom? Well, maybe these are all things we can answer if we are to observe existing simulations like Project Sid. Minecraft worlds are generated using algorithms like Perlin noise. The terrain feels infinite, but technically it isn't. Push the coordinates far enough and you encounter what's called the far lands, strange terrain glitches at the edges of computational limits. In Minecraft, it takes 2 billion steps to get there, so most players don't normally encounter them. But if Project Sid was left running, and the Steves gained some Columbus-like attitude and became set on exploring every inch of the sandbox, they would eventually encounter these terrains. To Steve, those distortions would feel apocalyptic. There are two interpretations of this, one positive and one negative. Either they're side effects of design constraints, and therefore natural disasters should not be understood as acts of cruelty, but rather just restrictions of an engine. Or we're in a deep layer of the order of simulation, and we've been going on for a little bit too long. That's scary because that means we're contingent on a whole chain of local gods. But also, if this immense evil exists and our environment is only getting more bizarre, what if the program is simply running? The local god got bored. But what if we're approaching our far lands? Climate destabilization, cosmic extinction. Are we an abandoned save file, an experiment that outlived its observer? Even if we accept a chain of local gods, simulations inside simulations, eventually there must be a base reality, an unsimulated level. And if suffering exists there, we're right back to the original theological question. So, the simulation theory doesn't eliminate the problem. It instead becomes a pressure cooker of responsibility, local gods within local gods. It softens the contradiction at intermediate levels, because local simulations need not be perfectly good, but emotionally, for our understanding of reality, it might be worse, and a worrying God is dead moment. Regardless, whether we're in a base reality or a nested simulation, suffering feels real from the inside. Meaning must be built from within the sandbox, and maybe the simulation hypothesis doesn't solve the problem of evil, but maybe it reframes it to a matter of authorship. If this is an experiment, if this is entertainment, then we may as well be at the mercy of our local god. Perhaps the only response is to live in such a way that even from outside the code, our world is worth running.